All right, how do you create your own feature layers from scratch using ArcGIS online? The first thing we're going to want to do is come over to our content page, right? This is probably where you spend a lot of your time if you're developing anything or creating anything in ArcGIS online. You can see I have all my content here. I'm going to click on New Item. Of course, I have the option, right, to upload existing data sets, which we probably covered in another video. But from here, to create a feature layer from scratch, no data, no fields, no nothing in it, go to Feature Layer. You have options. What I would say for those of you who are maybe outside the United States of America using a template, they're very American centric, and there's maybe Z's where you're expecting S's written into field names and such. You can use a template. They do have good ones that you can select from. You can choose an existing feature layer as well. But for this video, let's talk about how you can define your own layer, build it from scratch. Let's click Next. And bear in mind, right, like we typically associate, oh, yeah, GIS, maybe we have a shape file, maybe we have a tab file if you're using map info and stuff like that. Maybe you have a KML, right? Cool thing about feature layers is that it can have a lot of points, right? It can have a lot of polygons. It can have a lot of polylines as well. So you're not limited in your feature layers to say, oh, here is a point feature layer. Oh, here's another point feature layer. It's possible to house multiple different layers within these feature layers. So if I want to say this is points 1, for instance, I'm going to say it's a point layer. Let's click Add. I'm going to call this points 2. Give it a point layer. And then, just for laughs, I'm going to have a line layer. And I'm going to have a polygon layer. And I'm going to specify that that is a polygon layer. There are multiple point layers and table layers as well. Table layers, mostly if you're messing around with like related tables and stuff like that. But from here, this is cover a vast majority of use cases. It's either going to be a point, a line, or a polygon. But it is possible to have them coexist peacefully within the same feature layer. I'm going to leave all these other additional options as default. They're very kind of, depending on your workflow, you might want to enable them. But just to get started, create it from scratch. Basic workflow covers 80%, of the functionality. And let's give it a title. Let's call it, feature layer example. I missed a space there. Best practice, give it a tag, give it a summary, of course, but this is not real life. This is a YouTube video, so we're not going to worry about it. But best practice, always give you things tags, always give you things summaries as well. But from here, while that's loading in the background, so it's going to take a second just to cycle through, it's going to create a feature layer. Within that feature layer, then, I'm going to have 2 point layers, 1 line layer, and 1 polygon layer. Once it's finished creating my feature layer for me, I land on the item details page. And I might get a little message saying, oh, hey, you can finish setting up your layer. You can, specify the visualization. We don't have any data in it yet. But from here, right, I have my points, my lines, my polygons, all in the one spot. Now, the very next thing I probably want to do is add a few fields to this, right? So if I come into the Data tab, up the top left, you'll see, okay, attachments, they're there by default, and this thing called object IDs. Now, what you don't see is any kind of creation dates, if we're going to enable editing on it, if we want to keep track of edits. They're all automatic fields that we can add to it in a second. But up the top left, we have what I call points 1, points 2, lines, and polygons. To start adding fields to this, the easiest way to do it is navigate to the layer within your feature layer that you want to add a field to. Come over here to the top right, click Fields, and let's go add. And maybe you want like, I don't know, point type. You can give it a display name, of course, bearing in mind field names can't have any kind of special characters or spaces. Display names, your aliases, if you're coming from an ArcGIS Pro background. Display name, you can put in, you could even call it something completely different with spaces, tidied up, type of, point, call it a string. You can specify a field length, you can specify a default value, and you can optionally say, I don't want any null values in this data set. But I'm just going to leave it as default, put a string in it, and add new field. Just to iterate through then, when I'm adding fields, just to talk about the type, right? I'm not going to do any of this here, but we do have, big integers if we're dealing with millions and billions and trillions of stuff. We have date, which is a timestamp, right? So a date field has the year, the month, the day, and the time as well. If I only want the date only, there's a specific field for that. Doubles are for your decimals, integers are for your whole numbers, strings are for text, and then if we want to do the exact same thing with time only, timestamp offset as well. But typically the big three, the most commonly used field types, I would say, are going to be your strings, your integers, and your maybe dates. Now that changes. Date only, it's quite handy, for anything time series. You don't really want a time stamp on things, right? So you might only have date only, but they're the big three ones to look out for. String for text values, integers for whole numbers or decimals, right? Use doubles, and then date only as well. What you might also want to consider as well is if you have this, right? If I have type of point, what I might want to consider is everything is fully interactive. Like, this is the one benefit of ArcGIS Online over any other kind of web geographic information systems you might have, that like literally everything is like fully interactive, right? So if you do have your field names here, right, and I've configured it and said string, perfect. Now, there's a problem in data collection and data capture. If I have free text, people are going to spell things with lowercase. People are going to spell things with uppercase. You're going to have a mad individual who just caps locks everything, right? And then you're going to end up with pretty messy data, yeah? So what you might want to consider for your text fields, right, and depending on your workflow, right, it's not always necessary, but if we wanted to streamline data capture, if we're meant to digitize this, which we will be in a second, I can click on the actual type of point. This points me to the actual item properties of this particular field, and you can see here, right, allowed null values. Now, the only thing about that, when we are setting up the field, you only get one shot at that. You can't come back and say, no, I don't want to allow null values. You can make sure that it's editable as well, right? So you might have fields, it's a common use case where you might have your first 4, 5, 10 fields that are just general information about the data set. You don't want anybody to be able to edit it if they are, updating records or anything like that. So we can change that. We can we have our default value, which we set up as none, but if we did set up one, it would appear here. We have the field length, and then we have whether these values are unique. On the top right of this, right now, obviously, best practice description, field value type. If you are working in GIS teams, obviously we want to come into each one of these in an ideal world and give it a description. But if you notice on the top right, we have this thing called create list. And if we type in create list, so display value, I could put in spaces. I could put in spaces on both, right? This is the stored value. On the right-hand side, this is the displayed value, right? So you can see here, made a little spelling error. But if I type in, say, and again, this depends on your workflow, but if you had type A, type B, type C, what we're essentially doing here is creating, bottom right to save, we're creating a drop-down list for when people go to digitize these things, okay? Visualization, if I want to set, what each one is going to look like, right? And again, the same process can be followed. I'm doing it on points 1, right? But the same process can be followed for points 2, lines, polygons, when you're adding in fields. Now, if I wanted to come in here in the visualization tab, and let's go to Galway City, lovely part of Ireland. For those of you who have never been, I would recommend a trip. But the idea behind the visualization tab is that you can configure your 3 main touch points, right? For any data set, for any feature layer that you create in ArcGIS Online with the intention of sharing it out with a web app. We have 3 kind of checklists that we need to make sure of. We need to make sure it's symbolized clearly. We need to make sure the pop-up is meaningful, and we need to make sure our labeling is appropriate. So there are 3 touch points: symbology, pop-ups, labels. Anytime we add in a feature layer into ArcGIS Online, we always want to consider those 3 kind of core aspects: symbology, pop-ups, labels. So let's go through that now. For points 1, we're just going to do the symbology because I don't really have much on pop-ups or labels. I have other videos if you want to check them out. But the idea here is that we created a thing called a list. And if I wanted to symbolize my points while the user, right, while my end user is creating and digitizing those points, and maybe my end user in this case is myself, but I can go to field, I can go to type of point. You can see that's the only field that I have. But I'm going to click add, and that's going to bring up type A, type B, type C. Perfect. I can go to style options. And again, I'm not seeing anything in my map, right? This map is the extent of the layer that I'm going to add in, right? It has nothing to do with symbology because I have to go to map viewer to add in this. But if I'm happy enough, I have tons of different, options to choose from. I can make these diamond shape, right? I can make them circular. I can adjust the size automatically, or I can set a default size in here. There's tons of different color ramps that I can choose from as well. If I'm happy enough, a little pro tip as well, if you find a color ramp and you're like, yeah, maybe I could do that, you can also flip it as well, which means that the bottom color that you're seeing, right, particularly good if you have like only 3 values and you want to see what the bottom color looks like. It's essentially doubled your choices for color ramps. But once we're happy enough, maybe you want to give it a fill transparency, maybe you don't, maybe you want to change the outline color to a solid black, and click done. Once we are done with these things, I have the extent of my feature layer, right? So in this case, we're choosing Galway City. And I have the symbology set up correctly. And again, maybe I want to configure the pop-up now. Maybe I want to configure the labeling now. You can do so in the visualization tab. But once that's being saved, then we cycle through usage. We can see requests. Now, requests aren't views, right? It's everything that's being fully interacted with this data set. So you can see in the past 2 minutes, there's 18 requests, right? But you can see how often your data set or your feature layer is being used. If we talk about settings, we have these 2 tags. We can mark it as authoritative. So we're saying to people, hey, look, you can trust this data set. This is authoritative data set, particularly useful if you have project data sets and there's multiple versions of them. Think about revision 1, revision 2, revision 3, and equally V1, V2, V3, V16, right? We want to mark authoritative if it's to be trusted. If you want to prevent this item from accidentally being deleted, you can just by checking this box. What that does then is if anybody's in your content and they say, look, everything, select multiple content items and they press delete, it won't delete this one. Obviously, public data collection, if we are sharing it out publicly, and then the extent if anybody's in your organization or you're sharing this feature layer out publicly and people add it to the map and then they say they zoom in to an extent, for instance, Galway City, then we can set that extent that this data set is searchable by the extent. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just default to the world. What we can also do then in enabling edit tools, you can keep track of changes to the data. You can keep track of who edited the data. You can enable sync as well if you're working on offline. But you know, we might just want, if we are creating and digitizing feature layers, we might just want to be able to keep track who created the data. It also gives a creation date, and who edited the data. It also gives an edit date. And what you can do there then is what kind of editing is allowed. You can, you know, choose like nobody's allowed to delete anything off this data set, or people can only update attributes, all those kind of stuff. And then finally we come to it, export data, allow others to export. If you think your data is going to be like heavily edited, we can optimize layers, we can rebuild indexes, but not necessary because we just created this feature layer. If you find that your feature layer in time is quite slow, it's not as performant as it used to be, you can come in here, optimize layers, and rebuild your spatial and field indexes. But that is how to create your own feature layer from scratch in ArcGIS Online. Here's how to digitize it then. So we go back to Overview. You can click on the thumbnail itself, open in Map Viewer, or you can click on this button, this blue button on the top right, and open in Map Viewer. Now, if you remember, we symbolized anything that we do in the Visualization tab, we symbolized it based on this kind of type A, type B, type C. And we're cool enough here. So we have our feature layer example. Default Map Viewer is going to zoom out to the world. But if I zoom into my area of interest, I can change my base map, of course. In here we have a separate video all on the map viewer if you want to check that out. But I have lovely Galway City here. And let's say I want to zoom into an area. My feature layer example, right? Now this is a good point to note, right? They are grouped together by default. Okay, so I have my points 1, points 2, lines, polygons. Now, if I didn't want them grouped, I can just drag them out and go from there. But, you know, like my feature layer is created. I can see there's 4 different layers, 2 for points, 1 for lines, 1 for polygon. From here, the editing process is fairly straightforward, right? If we are doing points, right? If I click on edit, you can see here I have points 1, points 2, lines, polygons, right? Let's start off with points. So if I click on a point, and this is where my list comes in, right? You'll notice it's black by default with a little turquoise outline, meaning it's selected. If I go to type of point and say type A, it changes the symbology. If I select type B, just because I did that extra bit of legwork at the start in the Visualization tab, yeah? And we also have option no value because we allowed nulls, if you remember, when setting it up. And that is literally how to create, you know, like a point on it, right? Like I hit type A, I'm going to call this type B, and of course attachments. Anytime we build a feature layer from scratch, not using a template or anything like that, we have the option to attach photos, images, which you can disable if you want to, but it comes as default. And that is how to digitize points. The exact same principle applies. If we went back into edit, we set our points 1, which are our little default points, and just hit create. And that's the process. Just find your point on the map, zoom in if you need to, click the point, add in any fields that have been set up, and just click create. Exact same. If I click back here on the top right, want to draw a line, point to point to point to point, and then double left click. Now, unfortunately, like there's no freehand available just yet, but it's, you know, if you digitize the point, you've digitized the line, you've digitized a polygon, because it's the exact same process. Click a point to add what's called a vertex, right? So, you know, if you want to kind of smooth it line, we'd need to add more coming in, but that's the beauty of GIS. Double left click to finish, and then go in. You know, pro tip, I didn't hit create there. Whoops, on my polygon. But pro tip, if I did come in here to line, say, and you can see how it's like a purple line, and I change the style, right? So I don't have any fields or anything like that. But if I wanted to change this to maybe like a turquoise, give it a width of like, I don't know, 5, just to show you what can be done. You can change the symbology, and then what you can also do is go back to properties, then click on information and just save that. And that means that anybody that's saved with the actual visualization of the layer as well. So, you know, it's not necessary to do it in the visualization tab. It does help, you know, if you are creating kind of editing workflows for people to set up, you know, maybe consider lists, maybe consider how your data is being captured, but also then, you know, it's quite flexible, right? That if I come in and I have my line, or I have a polygon, and then I can change the style of it, and then I can come up to, you know, properties, information, save layer, and that just means anytime somebody adds this feature layer in now, called feature layer example, they're going to get that solid, bigger turquoise line. They're going to get, you know, the type A that we save back to visualization. So it is possible to save your visualization back via map viewer as well. But hopefully this video has helped you kind of demystify how you can create feature layers from scratch, how you can start to add your fields or your columns, right, to your attribute tables, and then hopefully how you can digitize as well. So digitize your boundaries, and then of course you're not stuck with the symbology that you set up at the start. If it changes over time, if you need to add more into map viewer, you can do that and save it back. So hopefully that helps you in your creating feature layer adventures in ArcGIS Online.